Okay, hi everyone. Welcome back to another VOX-Pol lecture. Today we've got a fantastic speaker. Lisa is a brilliant academic and researcher, one who has been a real pioneer in the development of the study of misogynistic incels. And we're in for a fascinating presentation today. Just as a bit of background, Lisa Sugiura is an associate professor in cybercrime and gender in the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice at the University of Portsmouth. She's an internationally recognized expert in online gender-based violence and technology, facilitated sexual violence, and regularly appears on national and international media news outlets discussing these subjects. Her research projects, which include funding from the UK National Cybersecurity Centre and the Home Office, involve language of cybersexism, victims of computer misuse, and the role of technology in domestic abuse, and also extremist and misogynistic behaviours in Manosphere and Incel communities. Lisa has published extensively in academic journals and the conversation on topics including online research ethics and qualitative methodologies, rape culture, incels, online misogyny, and violence against women. She's a co-author and co-editor of the books Respectable Deviance and Purchasing Medicine Online, Opportunities and Risks for Consumers, published within Palgrave Macmillan. The Incel Rebellion, The Rise of the Manosphere and the Virtual War Against Women, published in Emerald Publishing, and the Palgrave Handbook of Gendered Violence and Technology. Lisa, I think your book, The Incel Rebellion, is also, which ties in closely with this presentation, is also open access as well.
It is.
It's fantastic, and I would highly, highly recommend reading it if you'd like to learn more about this topic. So Lisa, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Martin, and thank you very much for inviting me to do this talk. I'm delighted to do this today. So I'm just going to share my screen and hopefully we can get this started. So can you see the slides okay?
I can, yeah, I can see the slides okay.
Okay,
You're ready.
fantastic. So I'll make a start. So today's talk is titled Misogynistic Violent Extremism, Incels and the Manosphere. So Suraj has already introduced me, so I don't need to sort of give too much of that background context. But just to say that I've spent the past sort of 7-8 years now researching incels, the broader manosphere, online misogyny and violence against women and girls. And much of this research has involved methods such as virtual ethnography and interviews as well. I was one of the first academics to conduct direct interviews with self-identified former and current incels online as well. So a bit more context about me as well. I'm the chair of the board of directors and the fellow of the Institute for Research on Male Supremacism. So a lot of my work is really kind of centered within the kind of male supremacism sphere. And the talk today is based on a forthcoming book chapter in the Routledge Handbook of Violent Extremism. Okay, so in terms of the sort of rise of misogynistic incels, I want to give a sort of context as to why I'm using the term misogynistic incels specifically. So the taking of multiple lives by men associated with the incel identity have catalyzed and accelerated interest into the sort of broader incel community, particularly after the 2018 Toronto van attack. And of course, there have been subsequent misogynist-related mass murders, which have occurred predominantly in places like the US, Canada, and even here in the UK. However, the origins of incels and the transformation from a supportive community into a male supremacist movement driven by misogyny and entitlement predate these violent acts. Hatred towards women, marginalised groups, and attractive men or men who support women and feminism expressed on incel websites and social media has largely gone unchallenged by tech companies and platforms, law enforcement, and policymakers over the years. So that, compounded by broader socio-political contexts and failures to address structural misogyny, has led to the predominance of misogynistic incels in the incelosphere. Now, misogyny extends beyond mere hatred of women. It encompasses action, including punishing women who deviate from expected gender norms. As Kate Mann notes, it is the enforcement mechanism of sexism. It involves the practices that keep the sexist system in place, namely the social norms, expectations, and consequences ordering the lives of women and girls under a system of patriarchal oppression. Now, we know about the etymology of the term incel and the original inclusive community that was created by Alana back in the sort of late 1990s. We also know that despite that community not necessarily being free from negativity, forum participants provided advice for persons of any gender, and moderators banned persons who expressed violent or hateful content. Now, some of the men banned went on to form their own forums where hate speech and expressions of violence were permissible, along with the glorification of mass murder and violence against women. These separate communities, which now dominate the incelosphere, purposefully exclude women, asserting that all women have access to and control incel men's access to sex, and thus they cannot then identify as incels. So an ideology of male supremacist entitlement to and dehumanization of women coalesces now in most of the incel spaces. And misogynistic incels continue to blame women who they believe are naturally inferior to men for withholding sex from them, but not only sex, sort of romantic relationships and companionship as well is something that they highlight. Problems begin with the term that researchers use to describe the population. When researchers refer to incel violence, they are more accurately studying the misogynistic incel men's movement rather than all incels per se. So when researchers simply use that term incels to describe misogynistic incels, they overlook both the historical and current exclusion of women from these online spaces and the male supremacism that defines them. They reinforce the misogynist incel men's perspective that they are the only ones who truly suffer from loneliness. So Carrion, DeBranco and Kelly propose that researchers conceptualize gender as a social structure shaped by the intersection of race, sexuality, and other axes of power. Gender intersects with other axes of oppression, which then bolster each other. Incel ideology and violence emerges from a male supremacist culture and a structure that reproduces cisgender men's disproportionate status, power, and resources. It is important to note, however, that misogyny is not exclusive to incels, and labeling misogynistic violence as incel violence can obscure systemic misogyny and discounts research on intimate terrorism and violence. Also, retrospectively labeling pre-existing misogynistic killers as proto-incels or ex-post facto incels overlooks the pervasive role of misogyny in interpersonal violence and violence against women. Now, in terms of the sort of development as well of misogynistic incels, some incels were formerly involved in pickup artist communities where they had unsuccessfully attempted to use pickup artist techniques to attract women, and that led to the emergence of anti-PUA communities like the forum PUA Hate, where men expressed frustration over this lack of access to women and sexual success. And despite claiming to dislike PUA gurus and techniques, these communities shared a common view of women as objects or rewards. And misogynistic incels in spaces like PUA Hate were then influenced by societal norms of sexual entitlement and the dehumanization of women, and that aligns them with other male supremacist groups. So, for example, the perpetrator of the 2014 Isla Vista attack, who identified as an incel on PUA Hate, which later became Slut Hate, posted a manifesto and YouTube videos expressing his hatred of women and desire for revenge against them for rejecting him. Of course, since then, he has become a martyr for misogynistic incels and inspired the creation of new online communities. And this categorization provides misogynist incels with more martyrs and further validates their cause. So today, misogynist incels dominate the incelosphere and deliberately exclude women, non-binary individuals, and men who support feminism. Despite debates, incels are often seen as part of the broader manosphere, and they share the ideology of male supremacist entitlement and dehumanization of women. And this ideology perpetuates a system of male supremacism, which, according to Carrion et al., is the cultural, political, economic, and social system in which cisgender men disproportionately control status, power, and resources, and women, trans men, and non-binary people are subordinated. While the manosphere comprises diverse groups, which I'm unable to discuss fully today due to time constraints, they share male supremacist beliefs and portray men as the primary victims of a society they view as gynocentric, prioritizing women over men. So the roots of the manosphere, particularly men's rights activists, can be traced back to pre-digital eras, including the men's rights movement and the men's liberation movement of the 1960s and 70s, which were initially associated with the women's liberation movement. And despite some initial alignment with feminism and recognition of patriarchy's negative effects on any gender, by the men's liberation movement, a faction emerged within the men's rights movement that turned against feminism. Now, this faction propagated the idea that feminism promotes a misandrist ideology. It asserts that feminine values dominate society due to feminism's influence. So men's rights activists blame feminism for undermining traditional patriarchal norms and laws, which they perceive as constituting that previous sort of golden age where men held superior status. So while some misogynist incels distance themselves from the manosphere due to mockery and disdain from other groups within it, the manosphere encompasses more than just these communities. It also includes materials that masquerade as men's self-help or address men's issues, often serving as thinly veiled misogynistic propaganda. One example is the now defunct Return of King's blog, which was run by the notorious PUA Roosh V. And that blog was aimed towards sad men seeking PUA advice. It perpetuated neo-masculine beliefs that women are intellectually inferior to men, as well as the male victim narrative complex, which is central to much of the manosphere content. The notion that men are the true victims is supported by the red pill ideology, and that's derived from the metaphor of taking the red pill from the movie The Matrix that has since been repurposed into a symbolic linguistic tool. And that ideology involves men awakening to their perceived reality, where progression from feminism and gender equality have oppressed men, with significant influence from forums like the Red Pill on Reddit, blending pickup artistry and men's rights. While misogynistic incels share some red pill beliefs, some also distance themselves from other manosphere rhetoric. Pickup artists and red pillers often focus on becoming alpha males and increasing their sexual market value through tactics like pickup strategies, weight loss, and even plastic surgery, often promoting rape tropes and disregarding consent. However, many misogynistic incels believe their situation is immutable, that there's nothing they can personally do to improve their chances with women, because women's choices solely rely on physical appearance, despite any red-pilled attempts to change that. So that is a central belief to the black pill ideology. And although embracing the black pill is a significant aspect of the misogynistic incel identity, it is also not exclusive to those identifying as incels. The black pill ideology perpetuates long-standing sexist and misogynistic beliefs. Notably, there is currently no evidence of incel-associated mass violence perpetrators explicitly referencing the black pill in manifestos or social media content pre-attacks. Although, of course, there is reference to incel beliefs and ideology. There's just no specific black pill rhetoric. Now, that adds complexity to understanding misogynist incels' potential classification as violent extremists, especially when they are dismissed as mentally unwell individuals, excusing their harmful behaviours by academics, policymakers, and the media. So, Bak Tarpid-Liang define violent extremism as a violent type of mobilization that aims to elevate the status of one group while excluding or dominating its others based on markers such as gender, religion, culture, and ethnicity. In doing so, violent extremist organizations destroy existing political and cultural institutions and supplant them with alternative governance structures that work according to the principles of a totalitarian and intolerant ideology. So according to that definition, there are three components key to establishing violent extremism. So first, there's that focus on totalitarianism and intolerance, in which subjugation and dominance over groups is legitimized. So with misogynistic incels, through the black pill and the red pill ideologies, viewing women as subordinate to men is justified. The promotion of these ideologies and efforts to ensure their immersion into the mainstream, which is occurring, underpins misogynistic incel activity. And secondly, within that definition, there's that focus on an anti-status quo political project that involves the creation of new institutions and structures of governance. Misogynistic incels, despite their denials, exhibit political motivation by advocating for the abolition of women's rights to autonomy over their bodies through calls for government-sponsored girlfriends, for example, the removal of women's suffrage, and even the legalization of rape. Effectively, they are seeking to further enforce male supremacy by the fundamental reform of legislation protecting women's rights. And thirdly, within that definition, there's obviously the use of violence highlighted. And that is a move beyond sort of cognitive radicalization that only involves sort of thoughts and beliefs. It needs to include sort of violent mobilization and behavior. Now, violence is central to misogynistic incels' pursuit of their ideological and political goals. And the violence is not just physical, as we've seen in obviously the tragic physical mass attacks, but there are psychological harms, and violence just completely permeates misogynistic incel spaces online as well. It is practiced and endorsed, and these spaces are overwhelmingly violent via the propagation and encouragement of mass violence and discrimination and hate, which is aimed especially at women and marginalized communities. And even if posters themselves don't have the intention to commit the actions that they are describing and endorsing, misogynistic violence and male and white supremacism is normalized. The casual encouragement and praise of mass violence, particularly targeting women, just demonstrate a callous indifference toward human life. And indeed, it is validating those who do commit physical mass attacks. And in the wake of several incel-related mass murders, the term incel, rather than misogynistic incel, has become synonymous with violent extremist behaviours. Consequently, organisations such as the Institute for Strategic Dialogue and the McCain Institute have directed targeted violence and terrorism prevention efforts toward addressing incel and misogynistic violent extremism. Attacks associated with incels, however, have not always been classified under existing definitions of terrorism. So Karen Gentry, for example, critically emphasises several historic and contemporary examples where it was claimed that misogyny and violence is not political and therefore it cannot constitute terrorism. And she argues that it is beneficial to consider misogynistic incel attacks as falling within the scope of terrorism and political violence. Scholars highlight that popular forums operate as echo chambers, requiring self-identification as an incel for participation, with community members often moderating these spaces and limited exposure to counter-narratives about societal perceptions. And additionally, men who are susceptible to indoctrination may seek out misogynistic incel forums, seeking a sense of belonging and community with others who share similar experiences. There's also been increased interest in classifying perpetrators of mass violence with perceived incel traits or affiliations as terrorists. However, those traits can also apply to individuals beyond the misogynistic incel community, including, for example, domestic abusers. And furthermore, acts of mass misogynistic violence are often labelled as incel, regardless of evidence, and that can potentially fuel further hero worship within the misogynistic incel movement. And additionally, these classifications can sometimes fail to acknowledge the broader political and social influences on targeted mass violence against women and girls, including male supremacism and structural misogyny. And misogyny is inherently linked with violent extremism, as perpetrators of terror attacks and often lone incident mass shootings often have documented histories of intimate partner violence. So narrowly viewing misogynistic violence as exclusive to incels separates these acts from the systemic issues driving them. It obscures the pervasive and violent nature of heteropatriarchy and misogyny that many women are experiencing daily. Forms of everyday terrorism, such as interpersonal and domestic abuse, alongside online violence and sexual harassment, leading to physical, psychological, and emotional harm, are significant manifestations of misogynistic violence within the context of male supremacist ideologies and political violence. So incels have been portrayed as sometimes as an isolated online group of troubled men with a negative attitudes towards women attributed solely to individual mental health issues or negative personalities. And this is often divorced from structural misogyny or patriarchal socialized systems. And then consequently, incels can be seen as distinct others. They are separate from ordinary men, They are the bad men on the internet, with overt sexism and misogyny confined completely to incels, rather than being recognized as part of wider societal structures. And some studies have heavily emphasized mental health and neurodiversity in incel communities without making those sort of broader connections. And whilst these studies are often careful to not claim that mental illness causes participation in incel forms of violence, they do use this emphasis to argue against classifying incels as a terrorist group, and often to downplay the inherent misogyny. The emphasis on mental health and depression in incel communities can inadvertently minimize the prevalence of misogyny, male supremacism, and entitlement within these groups. Studies that highlight the higher rates of mental health issues and autism in incel communities compared to the general population can also perpetuate an ableist narrative and make these communities more appealing to individuals who are facing bullying, social exclusion, and relationship difficulties that can be associated with autism or indeed neurodiversity. So it is crucial to recognise that poor mental health or an autism diagnosis does not justify or excuse the violence that is originating from misogynistic incel spaces. Mental illness, autism are not causative factors of misogyny and violence. And despite claims, incels are not the most vulnerable population in terms of mental health, whereas other vulnerable populations such as queer youth, who often experience mental health struggles, are unlikely to engage in mass violence. Misplaced focus on mental health issues linked to violence can also perpetuate harmful stereotypes about individuals with psychological conditions. So, for instance, autism advocacy groups have criticised attempts to blame autism for attacks, such as in the case of the perpetrator of the 2018 Toronto van attack. Instead of acknowledging the harm caused by misogynistic incels through violence, studies focusing on the supposed costs incels bear, such as loneliness, reinforce and validate that victimhood narrative. Elevating misogynistic incel convictions can also exemplify himpathy. Himpathy is a concept that was created by Kate Mann, and it involves the undue sympathy for men who have caused harm. Failing to recognise the misogyny that is inherent in the misogynistic incel men's movement, and instead emphasising mental health issues, ultimately normalises and excuses misogyny and male supremacism. Misogynistic extremism and mental health issues are not mutually exclusive, and the presence of one does not negate the other. Misogynistic incels can indeed be both violent extremists and mentally unwell, but they are not a unique or isolated group divorced from broader misogynistic social structures, and indeed there are parallels with other violent extremist groups as well. Indeed, Leidick suggests detecting and classifying incels beyond counterterrorism approaches to account for the connection between incel violence and structural misogyny. Mental illness alone cannot account for the mobilization of heterosexual cisgender men into the misogynistic incel movement. It is crucial to recognize that mental health treatment alone will not dismantle the misogynistic incel movement or prevent individuals from being radicalized by its ideology. Misogyny, rather than mental illness, serves as the primary driving force behind the misogynistic incel men's movement and its ideology. So to sum up, over the past decade, the misogynistic incel movement has rapidly expanded, overtaking what was once a gender-inclusive community. This growth has been accompanied by a disturbing increase in misogynistic violence, exemplified by a series of mass murder attacks carried out by self-identified incels or those affiliated with their ideology. However, it is essential to recognise that incel ideology is not new or distinct. It is a manifestation of systemic sexism and misogyny that is deeply ingrained in our societies. The misogynistic threat extends beyond incel and manosphere communities. It permeates broader societal and cultural structures that are rooted in misogyny and heteropatriarchy. Attempts to solely attribute violence to incel ideology overlook the underlying systems of oppression and violence, misogyny, male supremacism, and patriarchy. And so to address this issue effectively, we must accurately identify and confront its root causes. Terminology also plays a crucial role, and referring to all forms of violence as incel-related obscures the distinction between the broader incel population, those that align with the original gender-inclusive etymology of the term, and the misogynistic incel men's movement as distinct. Moreover, focusing solely on high-profile acts of violence ignores the pervasive continuum of sexual violence and misogyny that is experienced by women daily. And misogynistic incels serve as integral contributors to this system of gender inequality. Misogynistic incels engage in various forms of violent extremist behavior that extend beyond physical attacks. This encompasses emotional and psychological violence through their propagation of hatred and involvement in online sexual abuse and harassment. Legalizing sexual violence and the removal of women's voting rights, although I admit it can be sounds a little bit spurious, does illustrate explicit advocacy for transformative action, which confirms the misogynistic incels' politicality. However, there is a risk of depoliticization when narratives of mental health and neurodiversity are used to argue against classifying men who commit acts of terror as terrorists. Now, that's not unique to misogynistic incels, as the same forms of empathy are extended to white far-right extremists, where mental health is presented as an explanation for violence. It is crucial to recognize that mental health issues do not cause misogyny. Rather, misogyny is a societal ideology that is deeply ingrained in patriarchal structures. It promotes entitlement to women's bodies and perpetuates stereotypes of male aggression and violence. Addressing the misogynistic incel movement and other forms of misogynist extremist violence requires understanding them within the broader context of systemic misogyny and patriarchal norms. Therefore, caution must be exercised in pathologizing incels as either a form of exceptional terroristic behavior, or that they are simply a manifestation of mental health influences. So what we should be understanding them as is that in fact what they are is another manifestation of male supremacy. Thus, rather than scrutinizing the threat, white or male supremacy and cis heteropatriarchy, which is a concept that was created by de Cook and Kelly, should be challenged within society at the structural levels. We need to deconstruct the underlying sexism and accompanying racism responsible for fueling these beliefs and normalizing everyday violence against women and marginalized communities. Moving forward, policy practices, prevent, countering violent extremism approaches should adopt a comprehensive understanding of misogynistic incel radicalization and the spectrum of extremist violence that they currently employ and could potentially employ. Practitioners could take cues from the intimate partner violence field and treat mental illness and violence perpetration as distinct issues that require different interventions. Otherwise, failing to do so risks allowing the misogynistic incel movement to gain further traction in the future. And in addition, researchers studying misogynistic incels bear the responsibility of reflexively approaching their work and critically evaluating claims and behaviours to avoid falling into the trap of empathy. A feminist structural perspective on gender can therefore help mitigate empathy by enabling researchers to recognise their embeddedness within male supremacist structures and culture and prompt them to actively work towards dismantling these structures in their research endeavours. And ultimately, I think anybody working in this field, anybody researching in this field, must acknowledge and confront systemic oppressions that are inherent in their work and strive to contribute to dismantling them rather than inadvertently perpetrating them. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Lisa. That was fantastic. A lot of really kind of relevant contemporary information there. A lot of touched upon a lot of key points that I know many researchers within the field of terrorism are now thankfully starting to discuss as well. So if we can delve into some of those in a little bit more detail, that would be great. I've got a million questions. So it's such a fantastic presentation, but I'll try and get through some of the key questions in the time we have left. Can we start by focusing a little bit on the extremism aspect and the potential links between incels, misogynistic incels, and violent extremism? So within this regard, you're clear that we should call this particular subgroup misogynistic incels rather than incels, if I
absolutely.
understand this clearly. And there has, as you mentioned, there's been a real kind of increase in research on misogynistic incels by terrorism researchers of late. So you've talked about some of the challenges, but if you can talk about that in a bit more detail and some of the wider consideration, and what would be the kind of recommendations and the guidance you would have for researchers in this area?
I mean, I think the first thing is obviously using that time to kind of make that distinction between, the broader incel community. And I think there's a general, I think, understanding and recognition that incels as a community, as a subculture, as a movement, whatever term you are using, they are not homogenous. And I think I'm moving slightly away. I will come back, but this kind of polarization where it seems to be that kind of they're either terrorists and violent extremists or they're mentally unwell individuals. I think we absolutely need to be clear about who is being studied here as well. And I think absolutely having that terminology refined and saying, if you're looking at the misogynistic men's incel movement, that is who, I mean, essentially I and other researchers in the field would definitively argue are engaging in behaviours and mobilisation that is inherently akin to violent extremism. Whereas there may be others in the incel sphere that are maybe not as extremist. They're not necessarily as sort of they maybe not say they're mobilizing and they're not as violent in their behaviors, and there are some that that would say align with the original etymology of the term, and there are even men who support women. There are even obviously female incels. There's so many different, I think, different aspects to the different spaces online that that come into that term incel, that we absolutely need to make that definition. And then I think there's been a bit of a tension in kind of the whole violent, are they violent extremists or aren't they or not, I think is actually how that is understood. And I know there's been a lot of work written about this kind of this, whether or not they should be, that we should do this because of the securitization of it, because then there's an actual, there's an ability to do something about it, I suppose, in terms of obviously, legislation and regulation and CVE, but often that is done in a way where they are seen as something isolated and they're not connected, say, to the broader, the broader systems of misogyny. And then where it comes obviously risky is, I suppose, is how those individuals would be dealt with. And I said, if they're dealt with just under sort of CVE usual approaches and not recognizing that this is a form of, say, male supremacism, and it's inherently misogynistic, and it is linked to, say, perpetrators of domestic abuse and other forms of violence against women and girls, and those connections are not made. I think that's, again, this is where certainly myself and others working in this field have been kind of saying, yes, this is a form of extremism, but how this is understood and how it is responded to fundamentally needs caution. And I think so that I think it's just joining all of those dots, and often that is not happening. And it's, so I work in the space, and when I, and I've been in situations where you kind of try and raise the concerns about not just incels, but misogynistic or male supremacist ideology motivating terror attacks, and there's that reluctance where it's too big an issue, or it's responded to as, well, it's hate rather than extremism. And and I struggle sometimes to kind of say, well, yes, it's hate, but how, surely hate is a form of, can feed into extremism as well. So I don't understand why there's these maybe unhelpful kind of divisions that are coming up to what is obviously a really, really significant problem.
And so there's a recent kind of change to government policy or government thinking around the inclusion of misogyny within considerations of extremism. Does that, in your opinion, help or hinder the situation?
I mean, sometimes it can just be okay. So it's that recognition, and it can just be a phrase. It's still, I mean, it's actually what is happening behind the scenes to actually, to inform this. I mean, for example, you know, that, oh, now in the UK, police recognise violence against women and girls and misogyny as, you know, as a threat on the same level as terrorism, you know. And there's been lots of, obviously, media around that, and it's, you know, oh, now it's a threat. Is it? It's been a threat for a long time, and it's, well, it's still, and so if it's on the same level, what we're not necessarily seeing is, when there are these attacks, these acts of violence, there's still that reluctance to, one, recognize the misogyny inherent, and two, call it extremism or terrorism. So obviously these, and the sort of attacks I'm kind of referring to there, are not just those that are perpetrated by or associated with the misogynistic incel community. You know, I think there's so many, and again, I wouldn't want to kind of say that there are these acts that there's obviously a misogynistic motivation aligned with it, but I wouldn't want to say, oh, there's incels, because that's a problem where you start obscuring, obviously, the broader problems again. But I just think, in terms of, say, that kind of policy response to this, it's, you know, I think we'll have to wait to see in practice. You know, it's about actually sort of recognizing it. And of course, you know, you've got Canada that had, you know, obviously there was they actually did refer to an incel perpetrator as a terrorist. He was the first one that's convicted there, and obviously with their history as well of misogynistic violence as well, you know, I think there was obviously a lot of pressure for them to do so. So it would just be interesting to see if other countries follow suit.
That's what's fascinating, and I suppose something that I just thought about as you were talking is, if particular incels, sub-communities or misogynistic incels are labeled as extremism, is that sometimes counterproductive, in terms of, almost as we've seen with particular groups throughout history, using it almost as a badge of honor?
Oh yeah. Yeah, I mean, that is obviously a risk. But yes, I mean, they present themselves as countercultural, you know, and kind of clandestine, which is contradictory to, obviously, how much they impress their ideas into the mainstream as well, and actually how much of their ideology is grounded on things that pre-existed them as well. But yes, there's always that kind of, I think, those that are, as they, very much mobilizing. Yes, it does give them, say, that identity, that kudos. I mean, there's even, even in these conversations about, you know, incel or misogynistic incels, you know, one was giving them credence, reinforcing the title that they have self-chosen as well. It's the self-appointed identity that we are reinforcing all the time as well, and that's something to be mindful of. So yes, if, you know, by actually validating, I would say, their extremism and making them an officially recognized extremist group, then there is that risk, as you said, but that's not unique particularly to misogynistic incels, though.
Of course. And if we develop the conversation a little bit, if we think about, I suppose, kind of recent developments, not just within the UK, but globally as well, when we think about the normalization and mainstreaming of racism, far right extremism, shifts of Overton windows, where we see, you know, politicians, media outlets saying things now that 20 years ago would have been completely unacceptable. People saying things on social media, on the streets. In recent incidents we've seen in the UK. Can you talk a bit, I suppose, in that regard, can you talk a bit more about the overlaps between misogynistic incels and possibly incels more generally, and racism?
Yeah, I mean, I think, so, male supremacism, white supremacism, they go hand in hand. They obviously support each other. So, I mean, in terms of, within their kind of ideology, there's like the key overlaps in terms of, you know, that idea of, you know, wanting to go back to some sort of golden age as well. When was this? But apparently, you know, there's, it's obviously just referring back to, you know, very strict, rigid kind of gendered binary roles, right? And, you know, I think that there's obviously that which they, you know, they kind of go into, and obviously what we're seeing is that has roots, that is obviously really particularly influential in America, for example. And then I think there's obviously been research to kind of look into the kind of intersections, and it's not, I mean, I think I think with misogynistic incels, I think it is, I mean, they are a male supremacist group, and then as I said, there's like that kind of, oh, that has a natural allegiance with white supremacism, but I wouldn't necessarily say that was the kind of driving core. I mean, there's obviously racism inherent through how incels can interact, and even how they talk about themselves, and the language they use and everything. And there's obviously that hierarchy as well, where it which isn't just based on gender. Ethnicity does play a massive role in that as well. But I think, I mean, it's, for me, it's like they're just like building blocks all supporting each other. And I think what they do is obviously draw on what's going to appeal to people. And I think given the, there is just this really kind of racist sentiment that is permeating our Western societies, as you said, it is given so much validation and power through people with massive platforms, that I think it just, for particularly those misogynistic incels that are looking to mobilize, they will use that to obviously supplant their ideas as well, and reach more people and appeal to more people.
Thank you. And I could talk to you for such a long time about this. I know we're fast running out of time, so I want to move on to talk about another important aspect that you kind of focused on in the presentation, and something that you focused on in the chapter that you've written for the Routledge Handbook of Online Violent Extremism. Shameless plug there. That'll be hopefully available by the end of 2025, early 2026. And within that chapter, you also talk about the kind of mental health aspect, and I suppose the kind of how as researchers we need to be cautious with how we approach and address exploring mental health when researching incels, when researching misogynistic incels. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because I know in the chapter, and you kind of talk about how, I suppose that then sometimes draws the attention away from the hate, the misogyny, the racism, and other kind of hateful aspects associated, but it also kind of further victimizes
Well,
victims as well.
yeah, I mean, it's stigmatizing as well. I mean, to kind of, I think we've got to be so careful when we do talk about these issues. I mean, obviously very genuine issues, but they're not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily cancel out the misogyny and the hatred and the male supremacism. They're not mutually exclusive. So somebody can be mentally unwell and also be a misogynist as well. And I think, obviously I've been critical about some of the research that really kind of foregrounds then the mental health over everything else. And often that is used to, well, to deny them being extremists. So yes, I am critical. I mean, I do appreciate, as I think I said in the talk, I think they're careful not to make causal links and say, oh, the mental health caused it, causes them to be an incel, but they'll say it's a contributing factor, that they wouldn't necessarily be an incel if they weren't mentally unwell. This is where it gets very, I just think we just got to be so careful kind of navigating through this. And it's, so in the kind of studies that have been undertaken, and even sort of on the, just like looking at self-reports on incel spaces as well, there does seem to be a high self-reported rate. And even in the academic studies, this is always self-reported, it's never validated. And I certainly don't want to sort of be here and go, well, I just don't trust anybody, or you can't be, and also when, again, questions about delicacy, something so delicate as mental health, if somebody's lonely, depressed, anxious, all of the, I don't want to minimize that. These are real, genuine issues. But I think we're trying to do, obviously, really, sort of empirical scientific work. I think we do need to obviously kind of tease through those kind of methodological rigor questions, where it's like, well, it's self-reported, so we do kind of have to take that as is. And also, I think without kind of, and I think where it's been problematic is where it has been presented, and within the incel communities, where they present it as, like I said, that's, I'm mentally unwell, and so therefore I can say these misogynistic things and things like that. And of course, that is not okay. We do absolutely need to challenge that. And as I said, it doesn't cancel it out. It doesn't, that doesn't like remove the misogyny. It doesn't remove any kind of extremist behaviors. And it's just interesting that we see this with extremist movements that are related to male supremacism and also white supremacism, but we don't necessarily talk about the mental health of other sort of terrorism and extremist groups who aren't necessarily underpinned by male or white supremacism. We're not necessarily going, oh, they might have mental issues, and they probably do as well. Obviously, I don't ever want to discount it being a factor in there. I would hesitate about say that contributory factor, which I think has been used in some of the research. But I think there's a point of it, but it's something, it's part of the bigger picture, and it's certainly not the driving force, to be an incel, misogynistic incel. It's not, oh, somebody who's mentally unwell, that's the reason they would become this. There's that affiliation with the ideological aspects that is going to draw that person in far more than that individual, the individual problems which people do have. That is a vulnerability that is often manipulated by these groups.
Thank you. And I suppose we continue the conversation about that well-being, but actually talk about the well-being of researchers as well. And I know lots of students will be watching this and kind of ECRs as well. And we're thinking about the well-being and safety of those working in the field. What kind of should be the main areas of concern and consideration? I know you're I think you're the first person to qualitatively interview incels yourself, and we've spoken about this in length, particularly being a female researcher as well. I suppose what kind of considerations would you have for particularly early career researchers? Are there any kind of tips about keeping safe or considerations about preserving mental health that you might want to talk about?
Okay, so take a seat. I have lots to say on this. I'm also shameless plug. There's quite a few publications that address this actually that I've done, and I can share them again behind the scenes if you need them. Okay, I mean, I think there's some different. I think let's sort of maybe compartmentalize some of the different considerations also, although they obviously overlap. I think there's first of all those kind of maybe cybersecurity risks, the kind of external risks to kind of protect yourself. That if you are engaging in this research, which it is highly sensitive, and putting your head above the parapet, and and sort of your identity as a researcher in this field, that could provoke, I think, hostile individuals. And there's definitely been, not to worry people, but there have been cases where researchers have received abuse and threats and been doxxed and things like that. So it's the kind of digital hygiene kind of elements of this, about checking what's available about you online, trying insofar as much as possible to have boundaries between your personal and professional activity and accounts online. So obviously all your privacy settings. I mean, as far as possible, how much do you need to be visible, which is a bit of a tension, because obviously in academia you're supposed to build your reputation and put yourself out there, so it's a bit of a double-edged sword there. But it's about all of kind of that, to kind of trying to protect what people in the communities, movements that you're researching can access about you. Basically, what can they get to? Because then the other factor as well, it's not just you, it's obviously your loved ones as well, your family, your friends, your contacts. This is awful that we've got to kind of consider this and this responsibility, but this is the true fact of the matter. Is so all of that kind of digital hygiene is really useful. And then that kind of goes through into obviously the internal side of it, the emotional labor of working in this space. So I think the practical things that you can do, again, it's about maybe trying to put boundaries around your work and your personal life. So in terms of it's the amount of time you spend immersed in these sites, reading, reading the materials, if you are interviewing, that's another kind of worms I'll get onto in a moment. It's limit the hours, limit the exposure to this. Make sure that all your searches are done incognito, or using different profiles, so then your algorithms are not hitting you constantly with this content and you can never escape it, and it starts infiltrating into your personal social media and stuff. You want to have a break from it. You don't want it taking over your life, but also the security factors of that, in terms of you are researching this, you don't want to arouse the suspicions of the authorities either. So obviously be very careful in there. Obviously this would all come through an ethics application as well. And I suppose in terms of I have had direct interaction with members of the incel community, and like I said, some I think were on varying degrees in terms of the hostility and the misogyny as well. I mean, I argued with my ethics committee about being able to use a pseudonym myself, but that's not how it works with academic research, because of the concern of fraud and deception. So I had to obviously use my university email. I had to obviously keep my identity, and that was very concerning for me, having a rather unusual surname that is easy to Google. So I did kind of feel there was a very imbalanced power dynamic, where the people I was interviewing, they knew who I was, but I didn't know who they were. I interviewed through like Reddit messaging forums and things, and so they all had usernames anyway, and I mean, so I had no idea if they were who they said they were. I mean, obviously we can get into questions of validity then as well, can't we? So I'll kind of skirt over that one. But yeah, it was it was through messaging, private messaging. So even though I had offered them the chance to be interviewed over like Zoom or Skype or whatever, they didn't take that up, which I think is very telling of the people I'm speaking with and their maybe concerns and suspicions. But in hindsight, I'm really glad they didn't as well, because again, I think if I'd been a bit more prepared, or considered maybe some of the emotional labor and the potential risks as well, I would have said absolute messaging anyway, just keep it textual. I would never have wanted to kind of put myself out there. Although, another shameless plug, just got a new book chapter out with a student I supervise in Oslo, and he did interview incels over video conferencing, and it was very different. And I absolutely believe, as does he, and we explain it in the book chapter, that obviously him being male played a big part in that, and also not feeling the same concerns that I did as a female researcher as well.
What's the name of that chapter, and which book is it in, so people can
It is
find
called, so I think it's the Routledge Handbook of Online Deviants. I believe it's something like interacting with deviant subcultures online, gendered experiences of interviewing incels.
it? Great.
Guys, I get that.
Brilliant.
I remember that.
Sorry to interrupt, but I thought if people want to have a read of that, then they can find that. Sorry, carry on.
No, but I mean, I feel like I'm trying to get back around to, I think, just practical steps. So I think that's what people are going, stop waffling, get to the practical steps. So as I said, it's, obviously, if you're going to do research in this space, it's that hygiene. Do all your checks about everything. You Google yourself. Find out what you can find out. What can you find about you? If there's things you don't like, you can use the right to be forgotten, where it's not taken down, but it can be taken away from Google search history and things. Obviously, privacy accounts. And things like checking that your friends cannot be seen on your profiles, and just all of that. So just basic kind of cybersecurity, kind of go through all that, and then you have that plan to minimize as much as possible and avoid vicarious trauma from this as well. That these are hard topics, and the longer you spend in them, the more it can take its toll on you. I started to become rather desensitized at one point, and I mean, that's just alarm bells for me. I never want to be complacent about these issues with researching ever, but it does kind of say to me I need to come away, find your people as well, as I think is my biggest piece of advice. You know, it's you know, be able to speak with people that understand, that do this sort of work. You need to offload. So as a form of, as I say, trying to, you know, a bit form of catharsis, a way of kind of releasing all of the, you know, the emotional kind of impacts that come from doing this sort of work. You know, speak with people, fit in time to, you know, to maybe, I don't know, decompress, you know, once a week if possible, to whatever, just fit that chat time in where you can just offload it as much as possible. And so yeah, that plan of how long you spend in these sites reading this, if you are directly interacting, you know, maybe don't have those interviews all week or something, you know, have space, have break in between.
I think that's something that those of us who, you know, showing our age now, but those of us who have been working in in these types of spaces and researching these types of topics, whether it be incels, misogynistic incels, jihadists, far right extremists, you know, whatever it may be in terms of kind of hate or violence. I think some of us are really starting to feel the effect on this on our mental health. And I think it's something that's going to be a bit of an issue going forward. And thankfully, there are people at VOX-Pol and people elsewhere who are really starting to think about researcher welfare. And we've got a bunch of resources actually if you want to know more about this, if you're watching this and want to know more about this, and some toolkits are available on the VOX-Pol webpage as well. They should be easy to find on there. But if I suppose if I was going to give myself any advice, if I was to go back and when I was kind of starting researching this area, I suppose it'd be to kind of to be kind to yourself from the beginning and really be quite, yeah, really be quite, I suppose, observant and aware of the kind of long-term implications this could have on your own kind of mental health as well, and to, as you say, kind of take regular breaks, have your people you can speak to, you know, keep in touch with your line manager, and there are kind of also lots of resources out there to be able to support as well, and it's something you don't need to deal with by yourself. It's something that, you know, there
No,
is to
no,
be able
not at
to
all. And if
kind of help with as well.
just quickly, I think one last thing as well, it's about sometimes, you know, it's like just, you need to kind of remind yourself of your, you know, your worldview, your values, what is
Mm,
driving you to do this research, that kind of bigger epistemological picture of, you know, this is, you know, this is the importance of it, because sometimes it can be so overwhelming as
mm,
well. And I'm saying that sometimes it's not obvious straight away. It can take its time, and then you go, oh, I'm not okay. But it's, yeah, that kind of, you know, I say, you know, you know, what drives you, particularly when you are dealing with, I say, a lot of ideological stuff, and, you know, which kind of tests all of that all the time, you know. And it's like, no, you know, kind of stay true to you, and I say, the, you know, what drives you, that, you know, that.
absolutely. Can agree more. Well, this is very frustrating. It's frustrating because we've run out of time, and I have so many other questions, you know, I want to talk to you about. But maybe we'll save that for another time. I'd like to thank you so much, Lisa, for sharing your research and sharing your kind of ideas and thoughts and hypotheses and recommendations about this really important area of study. And if you can send me some of the kind of papers that you've talked about, we'll put links to them on the YouTube page as well, where this video is embedded. But yeah, thank you so much. Of really fascinating talk and a fascinating discussion as well. Thank
Thank you
you.
for having me.
Thanks.